In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world hangs in a perfect, gentle balance between shadow and light, the whispers of history carry us back to a time of heroes and empires. Our story begins not in the rocky fields of Greece, but far to the east, within the heart of the mightiest empire the world had ever known. This was Persia, a vast and powerful colossus that stretched from the dusty plains of the Indus River in India to the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean Sea, from the vast, cold steppes of Central Asia to the life-giving cataracts of the River Nile. It was an empire forged by the genius of its founder, Cyrus the Great, a conqueror who had displayed a remarkable and uncommon tolerance toward the customs and religions of the many peoples he had brought under his rule. But beneath this veneer of benevolence lay an uncompromising demand for two things: tribute and absolute obedience. In the late 6th century BCE, the throne of this great empire was held by Darius I, a brilliant administrator who had further organized the vast realm, building great roads, standardizing taxation, and creating a functioning imperial machine of unprecedented scale. His gaze, and the gaze of his empire, was turned westward, towards the small, fractious, and quarrelsome collection of city-states that dotted the Greek peninsula. These Greeks, with their strange ideas of self-governance and their restless spirit of independence, were a source of constant curiosity and occasional irritation on the western fringe of his vast domain. The seeds of the great conflict that was to come were sown in the Greek cities along the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. These cities, though now Persian subjects, maintained their distinct Greek culture and a fiery, independent spirit. And in the year 499 BCE, they rose up in revolt against Persian rule. They sought aid from their mainland brethren, and the rising democratic power of Athens, eager to demonstrate its commitment to Greek liberty, dispatched 20 ships to support the rebellion. This intervention would prove to be a fateful, and ultimately catastrophic, decision. Though the revolt was eventually crushed by the overwhelming might of the Persian army, Darius the Great had not forgotten the role the Athenians had played. In his grand palace, he instructed a servant to whisper in his ear 3 times every day, a single, constant reminder: "Master, remember the Athenians." The great king's first attempt at a punitive expedition against Greece ended in disaster when a violent storm wrecked much of his fleet off the treacherous coast of Mount Athos. Undeterred, he prepared a second, larger force. His heralds traveled throughout Greece, demanding earth and water, the traditional tokens of submission to the Persian king. Many smaller cities complied, but Athens and Sparta not only refused but, in a shocking violation of diplomatic custom, executed the Persian messengers. In the summer of 490 BCE, the Persian armada landed at Marathon, a coastal plain just 26 miles from the city of Athens. What followed was a battle that entered the realm of legend. Against what seemed like overwhelming odds, the heavily armored Athenian infantry, the hoplites, charged across the plain and achieved a stunning, almost unbelievable victory, shattering the myth of Persian invincibility. Darius was enraged by this defeat, but his plans for a third, even larger invasion were interrupted by his death. The task of avenging the honor of Persia now fell to his son, the new king, Xerxes. Unlike his politically shrewd father, Xerxes was a man driven by a powerful religious zeal. He viewed himself not merely as a king, but as the earthly representative of the great god Ahura Mazda. For him, the conquest of Greece was not just a matter of imperial ambition, it was a sacred duty, a divine mission to bring order to a chaotic and defiant land. For 4 long years, Xerxes prepared for his invasion on a scale that dwarfed all previous military undertakings. Storehouses bulged with grain at strategic points along the invasion route. His engineers, in a remarkable feat, dug a great canal through the Mount Athos peninsula to avoid the treacherous waters that had wrecked his father's fleet. And most ambitiously of all, they constructed two massive pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the strait separating Asia from Europe, each one nearly a mile long. When a storm destroyed these bridges, Xerxes, in his imperial rage, had the sea itself whipped 300 times, a symbolic punishment for its insolence. By the time he was ready to march, he had assembled a host so vast that ancient historians claimed it numbered in the millions. Modern scholars estimate a more realistic, but still staggering, force of between 100,000 and 300,000 men. It was an army drawn from every corner of his empire, Persians and Medes in their scale armor, Egyptians and Assyrians, Indians with their cotton uniforms, and Ethiopians draped in the skins of lions. It was a kaleidoscopic army, a river of humanity that, as it began its slow, inexorable march westward, was said to have drunk entire rivers dry. The great storm, which had been gathering in the east for a decade, was now ready to break upon the shores of Greece. As the great Persian colossus began its slow, inexorable advance through the territories of northern Greece, news of its terrifying scale spread throughout the Greek peninsula like wildfire. Imagine the fear that must have gripped the hearts of the people in the small, scattered city-states. Runners, their bodies gaunt and their eyes wide with what they had seen, would arrive in the market squares, the agoras, gasping out tales of an army so vast it drank rivers dry, of a force that churned up dust clouds visible for miles, of campfires at night that speckled the landscape like fallen stars. In an age of small, local conflicts, of battles fought between a few thousand men, the very concept of an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands was almost beyond comprehension. It was not an army, it was a force of nature, a human tidal wave that threatened to sweep over their world and extinguish their way of life forever. The challenge facing the Greeks was not merely a military one, it was existential. And their greatest weakness was not their small numbers, but their own deep and bitter divisions. The Greek world was not a unified nation, but a fractious collection of over 1,000 independent city-states, or polis, each one fiercely proud of its own distinct culture, its own laws, and its own traditions. For centuries, their history had been one of interminable rivalry. Athens and Aegina feuded constantly over trade routes. Sparta and Argos nursed ancient border disputes that dated back beyond living memory. Thebes and Plataea, though neighbors, shared little but mutual animosity. These ancient rivalries had shaped the very identity of each city. And now, survival demanded that they overcome centuries of mistrust and forge an alliance against a common enemy. In the autumn of 481 BCE, as Xerxes' preparations were nearing their completion, a congress was hastily convened. Representatives from some 31 of the most powerful city-states converged on the sanctuary of Poseidon at the Isthmus of Corinth. Here, under the sacred auspices of the gods, they formed what history would remember as the Hellenic League, though they themselves simply called it the Alliance. They swore a solemn oath to fight together, and, should they prevail, to punish any Greeks who willingly Medized or sided with the Persians, without coercion. It was a momentous step, but even this alliance represented only a fraction of the hundreds of Greek city-states. Many others, particularly those in the north who lay directly in the path of the Persian advance, chose instead to send the tokens of submission, earth and water, hoping to save themselves from certain destruction. Others, like the powerful city of Argos, nursing their ancient grudge against Sparta, declared a cold and pragmatic neutrality. The unity of Greece, upon which their very survival depended, was fragile and incomplete from its very inception. At the heart of this tense alliance were the two most powerful cities in all of Greece, Athens and Sparta. And they represented two fundamentally different visions of how this great war should be fought. The Spartans, the supreme land power in Greece, a society organized entirely around the creation of the perfect warrior, favored a defensive strategy. Their perspective was shaped by their geography. They argued for making a stand at the narrow Isthmus of Corinth, the land bridge connecting the Peloponnesian Peninsula to the mainland. This was a natural defensive position, a great wall that would protect their own homelands, even if it meant sacrificing all of northern and central Greece to the invaders. Opposing this view was the brilliant Athenian statesman, Themistocles. Athens, with its powerful navy, the greatest in all of Greece, advocated for a more forward, flexible, and naval-focused strategy. Themistocles, a man of incredible foresight, argued passionately against the Spartan plan. If we await Xerxes at the Isthmus, he cautioned the assembled leaders, we surrender half of Greece without a fight. The Thebans and the others will join him, not from cowardice, but from necessity. Every city that falls to him makes the next more vulnerable. He understood that this was not just a war to be fought on land, but on the sea, and that the key to victory lay in crippling the massive Persian fleet that supplied and supported their army. Into this tense atmosphere of strategic debate came the cryptic and terrifying words of the gods themselves. Emissaries sent to the great oracle at Delphi, the spiritual center of the Greek world, returned with prophecies of doom. When the Athenians asked how they might survive the coming onslaught, the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, delivered a chilling response: "Fly, wretched people, to the ends of the earth, for fire and swift Ares, driving a Syrian chariot, will bring your city low." Refusing to accept this verdict, the Athenian delegates pleaded for a more favorable prophecy. The oracle's second message offered a single, cryptic glimmer of hope. Zeus grants to Athena's wooden wall alone to remain unravaged, she prophesied, that shall help you and your children. Divine Salamis, you will bring death to women's sons. The interpretation of these ambiguous verses sparked fierce debate in the Athenian assembly. Some elderly citizens believed the wooden wall referred to an ancient thorn hedge that had once surrounded the Acropolis. But Themistocles, with his characteristic insight, insisted that it could only mean one thing: the wooden walls of their great fleet of warships. Meanwhile, Sparta received its own prophecy, one that was equally ambiguous, but far more personal. "Hear your fate, O dwellers in Sparta's spacious realm," the oracle declared. "Either your famed great town must be sacked by Perseus's sons, or if that be not, the whole land of Lacedaemon shall mourn the death of a king of the house of Heracles." For the Spartan king, Leonidas, a direct descendant of the great hero Heracles, the meaning was clear. He was faced with a stark and terrible choice. Either his city would be destroyed, or he himself must perish. As winter reluctantly gave way to spring, the great Persian juggernaut finally crossed into Europe. The time for debate was over. A decision had to be made. Under this mounting pressure, the alliance reached a difficult and brilliant compromise, a strategy that would marry the strengths of both Athens and Sparta. They would not wait at the Isthmus of Corinth. They would contest the Persian advance at two crucial, narrow points simultaneously. A small land force, led by the Spartans, would hold the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, a place where the mountains met the sea, a natural bottleneck where the Persians' overwhelming numerical superiority would be neutralized. And at the same time, the combined Greek fleet, commanded primarily by the Athenians, would engage the Persian navy in the narrow Strait of Artemisium, preventing the Persian ships from outflanking the land force. This two-pronged strategy, holding a pass on land and a strait at sea, was their only hope. It was a desperate gamble, a testament to the courage of a divided people who, in the face of annihilation, finally chose to stand together. To understand the stand at the hot gates, one must first understand Sparta. In the diverse and often chaotic world of ancient Greece, where other city-states celebrated art, philosophy, and commerce, the small polis of Sparta organized its entire society around a single, unwavering purpose: the creation of the perfect warrior. This militaristic focus, born from the necessity of controlling a large and restive population of state-owned serfs known as helots, transformed Sparta into the most feared land power in the Greek world. It was a society that functioned as a great and terrible crucible, a furnace designed to burn away all weakness, all individuality, all sentimentality, leaving behind only the pure, hard steel of the hoplite warrior. The Spartan system began at birth. Elders of the state would examine every newborn infant. Those who were deemed weak or in any way deformed were taken to the slopes of Mount Taygetus and left to the elements, a practice that ensured only the strongest would survive to become citizens. For a boy who passed this first, grim test, the true forging began at the age of 7. He was taken from his home, from the care of his mother, and he entered the Agoge, a brutal and all-consuming state-sponsored training regimen that would consume the next 13 years of his life. Imagine the scene. A small boy, his childhood abruptly ended, enters a world of harsh discipline and constant competition. He slept on a simple mat of reeds, which he had to cut himself from the riverbank with his bare hands. He went barefoot in all seasons, his feet toughened by the cold stones in winter and the scorching earth in summer. He was given deliberately insufficient rations of food, a single, coarse cloak for clothing, and was actively encouraged to steal what he needed to survive. But if he was caught stealing, the punishment was not for the theft itself, but for the clumsiness of being discovered. It was a relentless education in stealth, cunning, and self-reliance. Physical hardship, however, formed only part of their education. Young Spartans learned to read and write, not for cultural enrichment, but for the military necessity of receiving and sending clear messages. Their minds were honed just as sharply as their bodies. They studied the great war poems of Tertius, which glorified the beauty of dying in battle for one city rather than retreating in disgrace. And most distinctively, they developed the famed laconic wit, the ability to express complex thoughts with the fewest possible words, a trait so characteristic that our modern term laconic derives from Lacedaemon, Sparta's formal name. But the most important lesson of the Agoge was that of group cohesion. Unlike other Greek armies, which often celebrated individual prowess, Spartan training emphasized that the strength of the unit, the phalanx, was everything. A warrior's primary duty was not to himself, but to the men standing beside him in the shield wall. This mindset produced soldiers who did not break formation to pursue a fleeing enemy or to loot the fallen. They maintained their discipline, their perfect, bristling wall of bronze and iron, until total victory was achieved. Into this extraordinary tradition stepped the man who would come to embody it, Leonidas. Born around 540 BCE, he was not originally destined for the throne. As a younger son, he was not afforded the special treatment given to the heir apparent. He experienced the full, unadulterated rigors of the Agoge, an immersion in Spartan military life that forged in him an intimate understanding of the training, the capabilities, and the mindset of the men he would one day lead. Fate intervened when his older half-brother, the king, died without a male heir. The succession passed to Leonidas. By the time the Persian threat loomed over Greece, Leonidas had ruled for a decade, a king who exemplified the Spartan ethos of restraint. He lived not in a grand palace, but in a simple house. He ate the same coarse black broth as the common soldiers in the communal messes. And though he was a king, he answered to the laws of Sparta and the authority of its elected officials. He was the perfect product of the Spartan Crucible, a warrior king, ready to lead his people in their darkest hour. As the great Persian host continued its inexorable advance southward, a profound sense of urgency gripped the fragile Greek alliance. In Sparta, while the city was in the midst of the sacred festival of the Carnea, a religious observance during which all military action was forbidden, King Leonidas knew that time was running out. The strategic pass at Thermopylae, the hot gates, could not be left undefended. Yet to march with the full Spartan army would be to commit an act of profound impiety, risking the anger of the gods upon whose favor victory ultimately depended. He was caught in a terrible dilemma, a clash between sacred law and military necessity. In this atmosphere of dread and indecision, Leonidas did what any Greek leader would do when faced with a momentous choice: he consulted the gods. He dispatched emissaries to the great oracle at Delphi, the most sacred sanctuary in all of Greece, to seek the guidance of the god Apollo. Imagine the scene: the emissaries journeying to the great temple, nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. There, in a deep inner sanctum, the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, sat upon a tripod, enveloped in the strange, sweet smoke that rose from a chasm in the earth. As she entered her divine trance, her voice changed, becoming a strange and distant echo, and she delivered the god's prophecy. The message she gave to the Spartans was terrifyingly, heartbreakingly clear. "Hear your fate, O dwellers in Sparta's spacious realm," the oracle declared. "Either your famed great town must be sacked by Perseus's sons, or if that be not, the whole land of Lacedaemon shall mourn the death of a king of the house of Heracles." The prophecy presented Leonidas with a stark and inescapable choice. It was a divine decree: either his city, his home, would be destroyed, or he, a king and a direct descendant of the great hero Heracles, must perish. Leonidas, a man forged in the Spartan Crucible, a man whose entire life had been an education in duty and sacrifice, did not shrink from this terrible destiny. He understood that leadership, in this desperate hour, required more than just tactical skill; it required a personal, ultimate example. He would lead an advance force to Thermopylae, not just to hold the pass, but to fulfill the prophecy and, in doing so, save his city. But he could not command the full army to march during the sacred festival. And so, he employed a clever and careful interpretation of Spartan law. The kings of Sparta were always accompanied by a personal bodyguard of 300 elite warriors. He would take only these men with him, not as an army, but as his royal guard, a move that would circumvent the religious prohibition without explicitly violating it. The selection process for these 300 men was unlike any other in Spartan history. Leonidas did not choose the youngest, or the strongest, or the most eager for glory. Instead, he chose only men who had already fulfilled their most important duty to the state. Each chosen warrior had to have a living son. This strange criterion was an act of profound foresight and compassion. It ensured that should this mission prove fatal, as Leonidas knew it would, the bloodlines of Sparta's finest families would continue. It was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of their likely fate. On the eve of their departure, these 300 men participated in funerary rites, though they were still living, a solemn ritual that recognized the sacrifice they were about to make. And as they prepared to march, their wives presented them with their great bronze shields, uttering the famous, Stoic Spartan farewell: "Come back with this shield, or on it. Victorious, or dead, but never in retreat, never in disgrace." When Leonidas himself prepared to depart, his own wife, the intelligent and famously proud Queen Gorgo, asked him what she should do in his absence. His reply distilled the entire Spartan ethos into a single, simple command: marry a good man, and bear him strong children. His concern was not for his own memory, but for the continuation and the strength of Sparta itself. And so, this small, extraordinary force began its march northward. It was not a grand army, but a small band of brothers, a king and his 300 champions, reinforced by a few thousand allied troops from other Greek cities. They marched not with the despair of men going to their deaths, but with the grim, quiet determination of warriors who had, since childhood, been taught that to die for Sparta was the highest achievement a man could attain. They were the willing sacrifice, the price that the gods had demanded for the survival of their world. As they marched toward the narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, they were not just soldiers going to a battle, they were living embodiments of a prophecy, marching calmly and deliberately toward their own immortal destiny. The small Greek army, a thin line of bronze and resolve, made its way northward. They marched not to the sound of triumphant war horns, but to the steady, rhythmic beat of their own marching feet on the dusty roads of Greece. They were a force of some 7,000 men in total, the 300 Spartans of Leonidas's royal guard forming their disciplined, unshakable core. With them marched contingents from other allied cities, 700 brave Thespians, who had volunteered to stand with the Spartans, 400 Thebans, whose loyalty remained a quiet, unanswered question, 1,000 Phocians, who knew the mountain terrain intimately, and others from across the Peloponnese. They were moving toward a place whose name was known to them only as a geographical curiosity, but which would soon become a symbol of immortal glory. They were marching to Thermopylae. Imagine the place as they would have first seen it. The name itself, Thermopylae, means the hot gates, a name derived from the natural sulfur springs that bubbled forth from the earth nearby, filling the air with a strange, mineral-scented mist. For centuries, travelers had come to these springs seeking healing. But now, this narrow pass would witness not restoration, but bloodshed on a scale that would echo through all of time. The geography of this coastal defile was a rare and perfect convergence of natural features, a place that seemed to have been designed by the gods themselves for a desperate, heroic defense. To the north, the steep, almost impassable slopes of Mount Calidramon rose like a great, unassailable wall of limestone cliffs and dense forest. To the south, the waters of the Malian Gulf lapped against a narrow, rocky shore. And between these two great natural barriers, a coastal road threaded its way through three distinct gates or choke points. It was the middle gate, the central and narrowest of the three, that offered the most strategic value. Here, the passage narrowed to a space barely wider than a single wagon. It was here that Leonidas knew he must make his stand. It was here that the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Persian army would be rendered meaningless. Years before, the local Phocian people had constructed a low defensive wall near this middle gate to protect their lands from raids by their northern neighbors. Though it had fallen into ruin over time, the foundation of this wall remained. As the Greek forces arrived at the pass, they immediately set to work. Under the direction of the Spartan King, the soldiers of the alliance rebuilt and strengthened the wall, using local stones to create a barrier some 6 feet high. It was not a mighty fortification, but it was an anchor, a line drawn in the earth, a physical testament to their shared resolve. As Leonidas surveyed the terrain, his experienced commanders eye took in every detail. He saw the strength of the position, but he also saw its one potential, fatal vulnerability. The local Phocians, who knew these mountains as they knew their own homes, revealed the existence of a secret mountain path, the Anapeia Trail. It was little more than a shepherd's track, winding its way through the dense oak forests and across the treacherous ravines on the high shoulders of the mountain. but it eventually descended to rejoin the coastal road, behind the Greek lines. If the Persians discovered this path, the entire defensive position at the hot gates would become a death trap. Leonidas, recognizing this critical danger, assigned the 1,000 Phocian troops to a special task. They would not fight at the main pass. Instead, they would ascend the mountain and stand guard over this hidden trail, their knowledge of every twist and turn making them the ideal sentinels for this crucial flank. With his dispositions made, an eerie quiet settled over the Greek camp. The men made their final preparations. They were no longer marching, they were waiting. They could look out from their defensive positions, across the coastal plain, and see the endless, shimmering expanse of the sea. And they knew that soon, from the north, a different kind of sea, a sea of men, would appear. The setting itself, this narrow pass between the immovable mountain and the ever-changing sea, carried a profound symbolic resonance. Here, a line had been drawn that represented more than mere geography. It marked the boundary between two worlds, between two incompatible visions of how humanity should be governed. On one side stood the Persian model of a vast, centralized empire, held together by the absolute authority of a divine king. On the other stood the Greek experiment, a world of small, independent city-states, a world built on the ideal of human law and the concept of freedom. In the final days of waiting, Leonidas conducted the sacred religious ceremonies that were essential to Greek military custom. Priests who had accompanied the expedition examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, seeking divine guidance in the patterns they saw. The initial omens, it was said, were not favorable. They foretold death for those who fought here. But Leonidas, who had already heard and accepted the Delphic prophecy about his own necessary sacrifice, pressed forward undeterred. He knew his fate. His concern now was not for his own life, but for how he and his men would meet that fate. As night fell over the pass, the men would gather around their small campfires. And in the strange, sulfur-scented air, under a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly bright and close in this wild place, the Spartans would engage in their traditional battle preparations. They would sit calmly, combing their long hair, a ritual that seemed bizarre to the other Greeks, but which, for the Spartans, was an act of serene and defiant preparation for death. They were making themselves beautiful for the great and final contest that awaited them. As the first light of dawn illuminated the coastal corridor, the mists from the hot springs would part to reveal the Greek position. An unbreachable wall of bronze shields, a silent, bristling hedge of deadly iron-tipped spears, and a small band of free men, waiting calmly for the arrival of the largest army the world had ever known. For 4 long days, the great king Xerxes waited. From a white marble throne specially constructed for him on a nearby hillside, he looked down upon the small, insignificant band of Greeks who dared to block his path. He watched them with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. He could not comprehend their purpose. He was the great king, the king of kings, the master of an empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia. His army was a force of nature, a human ocean that had drunk rivers dry on its march. And before him stood a mere handful of men, perhaps 7,000 in total, a force so small it was almost a rounding error in the grand mathematics of his own host. He was certain that once they saw the full, terrifying extent of his army, their courage would fail and they would disperse in fear. So he waited, giving them time to reconsider their hopeless position. On the 5th day, his patience had worn thin. He sent a scout on horseback to observe the enemy camp more closely. The scout returned with a perplexing report. The Greeks were not preparing for flight. Instead, The Spartans at the front of the pass were engaged in what appeared to be surprisingly casual activities. Some were exercising naked, their bodies gleaming with oil. Others were calmly and methodically combing their long, beautiful hair. Xerxes, upon hearing this, reportedly laughed out loud. He could not understand this bizarre behavior. He summoned Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king who now served as his advisor. "What is the meaning of this?" the great king demanded. "Are these men mad, that they prepare for their own annihilation with athletic games and personal grooming?" Demaratus listened, his face grim. "O king," he replied, "I have told you before of these men, but you would not listen. It is their custom to attend to their hair with special care when they are about to risk their lives. Know this, you are now facing the noblest kingdom in all of Greece, and the bravest men." Xerxes, still convinced that such a small force could not possibly stand against him, dismissed the warning. His patience was at an end. He gave the order for the first assault. The attack began not with a charge of men, but with a storm of arrows. The Persian archers, thousands upon thousands of them, unleashed a thunderous volley into the sky. It is said that the sheer number of arrows was so great that they blotted out the sun, casting a brief, premature twilight over the battlefield. It was this moment that prompted the famous laconic remark from the Spartan warrior Dionysus. When told of the overwhelming number of Persian arrows, he simply replied, "Good. Then we shall have our battle in the shade." The great missile storm, designed to terrify and demoralize the defenders, had little physical effect. Most of the arrows clattered harmlessly against the Greeks' overlapping bronze shields, or embedded themselves in the rebuilt Phocian wall behind which they stood. Then came the first great wave of infantry. Xerxes sent forward his Median and Sicyan troops, men from the heart of his empire, ordering them to take the Greeks alive and bring them before his throne. They advanced in densely packed columns, their numbers a great, churning river of men, flowing towards the narrow pass. But as they entered the bottleneck of the middle gate, their great numbers became a weakness. They were compressed, losing their formation, their movements constricted by the narrow space between the mountain and the sea. The Greeks awaited this advance in their signature phalanx formation. The front rank knelt, their great, round shields, the aspes, braced against the ground, presenting an unbroken wall of bronze to the approaching enemy. Behind them, the subsequent ranks held their long, iron-tipped spears, the dory, at varying heights, creating a bristling hedge of lethal points. When the Median wave crashed against this formation, it was like a wave of the sea crashing against a stone cliff. The Persian soldiers, with their shorter spears and lighter wicker shields, found themselves unable to penetrate the disciplined Greek shield wall. The longer Greek spears outreached their own weapons, allowing the defenders to inflict terrible casualties while remaining largely protected. As the Persian assault intensified, the true superiority of the Greek heavy infantry revealed itself. The phalanx was not merely a defensive barrier, it was an offensive weapon, a collective battering ram of bronze and muscle. Using a coordinated technique called the othismos, or the push, the Greek front ranks literally pressed forward as one, driving their shields into the enemy, while the rear ranks added their physical pressure, a great, unified shove that forced the Persians back, often causing them to stumble and fall over their own dead and wounded comrades. And all the while, the disciplined rotation system employed by Leonidas maintained the Greeks' fighting effectiveness. When the frontline fighters grew tired, a trumpet would signal a carefully rehearsed maneuver. Fresh troops would move forward through the ranks to replace the exhausted vanguard, executed so smoothly and so quickly that the front line never lost its cohesion. After several hours of these futile assaults, which achieved nothing but mounting casualties. The battered Median and Sicyan units withdrew. Xerxes, watching from his throne on the hillside, reportedly leaped to his feet in rage 3 times as he watched his troops being so easily repulsed. He immediately ordered his elite personal guard, the Immortals, to advance and break the Greek position. These were the finest soldiers in the Persian army, a force of 10,000 men, so named because their numbers were always kept constant, with any casualty being immediately replaced. They advanced with a disciplined precision that was uncommon among the other imperial contingents. But even these elite troops found themselves neutralized by the brutal, unforgiving calculus of the mountain corridor. Their superior numbers were meaningless. The battle once again reduced to a contest of equipment, training, and sheer will. As dusk began to approach, the Immortals also withdrew, having failed to make any dent in the Greek line. The first day's fighting had yielded a shocking and unbelievable outcome. The world's greatest empire had hurled thousands of its best warriors against a few hundred Greeks and had achieved nothing. Xerxes, a king accustomed to swift and easy victories, now found himself confronting an unfamiliar and deeply unsettling situation, an enemy that neither feared his numbers nor respected his divine authority. As night fell over the pass, a quiet filled with the sounds of the wounded and the dying, the great king was left to contemplate the unexpected resilience of the strange, free men who had come to the hot gates to die. As dawn broke on the second day of the battle, a grim and telling silence hung over the Persian camp. The usual confident bustle that preceded a great imperial victory was absent, replaced by a quiet, somber mood. The previous day's fighting had been a profound shock to the Persian psyche. They had thrown thousands of their warriors, including the elite of the Medes and Scythians, against a tiny, seemingly insignificant Greek force, and they had been repulsed with heavy casualties. King Xerxes, watching from his throne on the hillside, had been forced to witness the unthinkable, the disciplined retreat of his own forces, leaving their dead piled up before an unbroken wall of Greek bronze. The great king's frustration now curdled into a cold and determined rage. He could not comprehend what he had seen. He summoned his commanders to his great pavilion. He could not accept that the finest soldiers from the heart of his empire had failed. He resolved that on this second day, there would be no mistakes. He would unleash the full, terrifying might of his greatest warriors, his personal guard, the legendary 10,000 Immortals. They were the very best of his army, a force that had never known defeat, and he was certain that they would succeed where the others had failed. They would not just break the Greek line, they would annihilate it, and erase this impudent display of defiance from the earth. Across the narrow pass, the mood in the Greek camp was entirely different. They were exhausted, their bodies aching from the previous day's brutal combat. But their hearts were filled with a new and powerful sense of resolve. They had faced the first great wave of the Persian host, and they had held. They had proven to themselves, and to the world, that the great empire was not invincible. As the sun rose, the Spartans once again performed their morning rituals, combing their long hair with a calm and deliberate composure that so unnerved their enemies. They were preparing themselves not just for battle, but for another day of honorable death. Xerxes, learning from the previous day's failures, modified his tactics. Instead of a single, sustained assault, he ordered a series of coordinated, relentless waves of fresh troops. His plan was simple and brutal: to wear down the numerically inferior Greeks through sheer, grinding attrition. The assault began again with a great storm of arrows, and then, the first wave of Persian infantry charged forward, their war cries echoing off the high cliffs of the pass. And once again, they crashed against the unyielding wall of the Greek phalanx. The disciplined rotation system of the Greeks proved to be the key to their incredible endurance. As the frontline warriors began to tire, a signal would be given, and a fresh rank of men would move forward to seamlessly take their place. For the Persians, it must have seemed as if they were fighting against men who did not tire, a machine of war that could not be broken. For hours, the battle raged, a terrible, rhythmic cycle of charge, clash, and retreat. The narrow pass was a cauldron of chaos, the air thick with the dust of battle, the clang of bronze on bronze, and the desperate cries of men. Finally, seeing that these frontal assaults were proving just as futile as those of the day before, Xerxes gave the order he had been holding in reserve. He sent in the immortals. They advanced with a disciplined precision that set them apart from the other imperial contingents, their scale armor glittering in the sun, their movements confident and professional. But even these elite troops, the pride of the Persian Empire, found themselves neutralized by the brutal, unforgiving calculus of the hot gates. Their superior numbers were meaningless. Their individual skill was negated by the collective, unified strength of the Greek phalanx. The battle once again reduced to a primal contest of equipment, discipline, and sheer will. And in this contest, the Greeks proved superior. As the second day of fighting drew to a close, the immortals, battered and having suffered heavy losses, also withdrew. A great cry of triumph went up from the Greek lines. They had now faced the very best that the Persian Empire could throw at them, and they were still standing. The psychological impact of this second day's failure on the Persian camp was immense. Their greatest warriors had been repulsed. Their king had been humiliated. And the small band of Greeks in the past now seemed less like men and more like demigods, invincible and untouchable. Xerxes was at his wits' end. His great army, the most powerful in the world, was being held at bay by a handful of stubborn warriors in a narrow, insignificant pass. As night fell, he paced his tent, his mind racing, desperately searching for another solution, another way to break this unbreakable wall of bronze. And it was on this night, in this moment of royal desperation, that an unexpected visitor was brought to his camp, a local Greek man, a traitor, who would offer the great king the one thing he now so desperately needed, a secret path. As the second day of the battle drew to its bloody, inconclusive end, King Xerxes, from his throne on the hillside, was in a state of profound frustration and mounting rage. His finest troops, including his own elite immortals, had been repulsed with heavy losses. The small band of Greeks in the narrow pass seemed invincible, their discipline unbreakable, their courage absolute. The great king was at his wits' end. His grand invasion, which was supposed to be a swift and overwhelming display of Persian power, was now bogged down, held at bay by a handful of stubborn warriors in an insignificant mountain pass. As night fell, he paced his great pavilion, his mind racing, desperately searching for another solution, another way to break this unbreakable wall of bronze. It was on this night, in this moment of royal desperation, that an unexpected visitor was brought to his camp. He was a local man, a Greek from the region of Malice, his face a mixture of greed and fear. His name was Ephialtes, a name that would, for millennia to come, become synonymous with the very act of treachery. He had come to the Persian king with a secret he was willing to sell for a great reward. He told Xerxes that he knew of a hidden path, a little-known trail that wound its way through the dense forests and over the high shoulders of Mount Calidramon, a path that would allow the Persian army to circumvent the main pass and attack the Greek defenders from behind. Xerxes listened with a growing sense of excitement. This was the solution he had been searching for. He immediately grasped the strategic opportunity and ordered Hydarnes, the commander of his elite immortals, to lead a force of 10,000 men along this hidden path under the cover of darkness. As Ephialtes prepared to guide the Persian force, the fate of the defenders at Thermopylae was sealed, not by the strength of Persian arms, but by the quiet, treacherous whisper of a single man. Imagine the scene. In the darkest hours before the dawn of the third day, while the Greek defenders slept in brief, exhausted respite from the battle, the long column of Persian immortals began its silent ascent. The Anapaea path was narrow and treacherous, more suited to mountain goats than to heavily armored men. It twisted its way through dense oak forests, where the moonlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy of leaves. It crossed deep, rocky ravines on precarious, narrow ledges. The men moved in single file, their progress slow and difficult, their silence absolute. Leading them through this dark and difficult terrain was the traitor, Ephialtes. Leonidas, the Spartan king, had not overlooked this danger. He knew of the mountain path, and he had stationed the 1,000 Phocian hoplites along its length precisely to prevent such a flanking maneuver. They were the sentinels, the guardians of the Greek rear. As the Persian column approached the Phocian position under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, an unexpected sound betrayed their advance. There was no wind, and the night was still. But the sound of thousands of feet crunching on the thick carpet of fallen oak leaves was amplified by the mountain silence. The rustling of the leaves alerted the Greek sentries. The Phocian commanders, startled from their sleep, hastily roused their men. Still adjusting their armor and forming their ranks, they watched as the shadowy mass of Persian infantry emerged from the forest. The immortals, seeing these defenders, also halted their advance, and for a moment, a tense standoff ensued. The Phocians, believing they were the primary target of this force, withdrew to a defensible slope adjacent to the path and prepared for a pitched battle. But here, a fateful and disastrous miscalculation occurred. Hydarnes, the Persian commander, had his orders. His objective was not to engage and defeat every Greek unit he encountered. His objective was to complete the flanking maneuver. He ordered his men to simply bypass the Phocians, to ignore them. The Persian column diverted slightly from the path, keeping to the forest cover, and continued its inexorable advance, leaving the bewildered Phocians standing on their hilltop position. When the Phocian officers realized what had happened, they dispatched runners to alert Leonidas. These messengers raced down the mountain paths, but the treacherous terrain and the circuitous route delayed their arrival. Meanwhile, back at the main pass, the first light of dawn brought fresh Persian assaults against the Greek front. But these attacks seemed strangely less determined than those of the previous days, almost perfunctory. The experienced Spartan officers sensed that something had changed in the Persian approach, but they could not yet identify what it was. Midway through the morning, the runners from the Phocian contingent finally reached Leonidas with their alarming news. The king immediately convened a council of his commanders. Scouts confirmed the terrible truth: a substantial Persian force had bypassed the Phocian guards and would reach the Greek rear within hours. The strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The position at Thermopylae, so brilliantly defensible from the front, would now become a death trap. The Greeks were about to be surrounded. The traitor's path had led the enemy to their back door. In the gray, pre-dawn light of the third day, as the first birds began to stir in the oak forests on the high slopes of Mount Calidramon, the terrible news finally reached the Greek camp. A runner, his face pale with exhaustion and dread, stumbled into the presence of King Leonidas. He brought the dire message from the Phocian guard stationed on the high mountain pass: the immortals had broken through. The traitor Ephialtes had shown them the way. A great Persian force was, at that very moment, making its way down the mountain to attack the Greek position from the rear. The pass was no longer a fortress, it had become a trap. Leonidas listened to the report with the calm, unwavering composure of a Spartan king. He immediately convened a council of the remaining Greek commanders. Imagine the scene in the king's tent as the dawn's first light began to filter through. The air was thick with a new and terrible tension. The leaders of the allied contingents gathered, their faces grim, their minds reeling from the catastrophic news. A heated and desperate debate erupted. Some of the commanders, their voices sharp with a pragmatic urgency, argued for an immediate and full withdrawal. Their mission, they contended, had been to hold the pass and delay the Persian advance. That mission had now been compromised. To remain was not courage, it was suicide. They argued that they should retreat while the path south remained open, to save their armies, to regroup, and to fight another day, perhaps at the Isthmus of Corinth, as the Peloponnesians had originally wished. Others argued for a more defiant, if equally desperate, course of action. They spoke of holding their ground until nightfall, and then attempting a breakout under the cover of darkness. But Leonidas, having listened to all the arguments, his mind clear and his purpose now absolute, finally rose to speak. And his decision would echo through all of history. He did not order a suicidal last stand for the entire army. Nor did he order a full retreat, which he knew would likely devolve into a panicked rout, with the swift Persian cavalry cutting down his forces on the open ground to the south. He announced a different, more complex, and more noble plan. He formally dismissed the majority of the allied contingents. He ordered them to withdraw, to retreat with all speed, to carry the news of what had happened here, and to preserve their strength for the great battles that were still to come. Their duty, he told them, was now to live, and to fight for Greece on another day. He, however, would remain. He and his 300 Spartans would stay and hold the pass. This decision was a profound one, rooted in the deepest principles of Spartan law, military necessity, and his own personal, tragic destiny. From a tactical perspective, a rear guard was absolutely essential. Without a covering force to delay the Persian pursuit, the retreating Allied army would be an easy target. The sacrifice of a smaller force could ensure the survival of the larger army. Culturally, the decision was even more profound. Spartan law and honor forbade a warrior from ever retreating or surrendering. The famous injunction, to return with one's shield or on it, was not a mere saying, it was the very bedrock of their society. For a Spartan king to abandon his post in the face of the enemy, no matter the odds, would be an unthinkable disgrace, a violation of the sacred trust that bound him to his people and his gods. And most personally, the Delphic prophecy still hung over Leonidas's decision. The oracle had decreed that either Sparta would fall or a king of the line of Heracles must perish. Leonidas, in this final, terrible moment, chose to embrace his fate, to offer his own life as the willing sacrifice that would preserve his city. As the Allied contingents began to prepare for their hasty departure, a remarkable thing happened. The contingent of 700 Thespians, citizen soldiers from a small city in Boeotia, led by their general, Thermopylae, announced that they would not leave. They voluntarily chose to remain with the Spartans, to share in their certain fate. This decision, less heralded in popular history than the Spartan sacrifice, was in many ways even more extraordinary. The Spartans were professional soldiers, men who had been raised from birth for this very purpose. The Thespians were ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, citizens, who were not bound by the same rigid code of military honor. Yet, they chose to stay. Their sacrifice was a testament to the fact that the emerging concept of Greek freedom was a cause for which even ordinary men were willing to die. The Theban contingent of 400 men also remained, though the reasons for their presence are more debated. Some historians, following the account of Herodotus, suggest that Leonidas, doubting their loyalty, kept them as effective hostages to ensure that their city, Thebes, would not immediately join the Persian side. As the majority of the Greek army began its long march southward, those who remained at the hot gates prepared for their final defense. There were the 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and the 400 Thebans. They were no longer fighting to hold a position, they were fighting for time, and for glory. The atmosphere in the small camp on this final morning was not one of despair, but of a quiet, grim resolve. According to the historian Plutarch, as the men prepared for their final, sparse meal, Leonidas looked at them and, with that famous laconic wit, said, "Dine well, men, for tonight we shall dine in the underworld." Knowing that death was now inevitable, Leonidas changed his tactics. He would no longer fight defensively behind the Phocian wall. He would lead his men out into the wider part of the pass, to meet the frontal Persian assault in a final, glorious, and suicidal charge. His objective was no longer to survive, but to exact the maximum possible cost from the enemy, to make his death, and the death of his men, a warning and an inspiration that would echo throughout all of Greece. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, and as the great mass of the Persian army began its final, coordinated advance from both the front and the rear, the small band of heroes at Thermopylae prepared to meet them, their hearts filled not with fear, but with a fierce and defiant acceptance of their immortal destiny. As dawn broke on the final day at the hot gates, a crimson sky, the color of spilled wine, heralded the blood that would soon stain the narrow pass. The remaining defenders, the 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and the 400 Thebans, no longer fighting for victory, but for how they would be remembered, abandoned their previous defensive positions behind the Phocian wall. Their objective had changed. They were no longer constrained to holding ground, they sought now to exact the maximum possible price from their attackers. Leonidas led his men out from the narrows and into the wider part of the mountain corridor, a tactical shift that signaled a fundamental change in their purpose. They were transforming from defenders into avengers, their goal to inflict such a wound upon the Persian host that it would be remembered forever. The Greeks now fought with a reckless, almost joyful abandon. The historian Herodotus writes that they fought with a fury that bordered on madness, using their hands and their teeth when their weapons broke. This desperate, final fury stemmed not from a fear of death, but from a cold and noble calculation. Every Persian slain on this battlefield would be one less to march against their retreating comrades, one less to threaten their homes and their families in the south. Xerxes, having witnessed 2 days of costly frontal assaults, now orchestrated a more methodical and overwhelming attack. He ordered a coordinated assault from both front and rear. The immortals, who had navigated the treacherous mountain path, now closed the trap from behind, while fresh waves of infantry pressed from the front. The Persian officers, understanding the suicidal resolve of their opponents, now drove their own reluctant infantry forward with whips, forcing waves of men against the Greek position through pure intimidation. As the encirclement was completed, the Greeks formed a compact circle on a small hillock within the pass, defending in all directions simultaneously. With their great bronze shields facing outward and their long spears bristling in all directions, they resembled a great, bronze-armored hedgehog, awaiting the final thrusts of the hunter's spears. Individual acts of heroism punctuated this final, collective struggle. The Spartan warrior Dionysus, already renowned for his laconic wit, fell while protecting a wounded comrade. The brothers Alpheus and Maron fought side by side, as they had since childhood, accounting for dozens of Persian casualties before they were finally overwhelmed. And King Leonidas himself fought in the very forefront of the battle, never commanding from behind, but embodying the great Spartan principle that a leader must share every danger with the men he leads. The death of the king marked a crucial turning point in this final, desperate battle. The ancient sources disagree on precisely how Leonidas fell. Some claim a Persian arrow found its mark. Others that a group of Persian spearmen, recognizing the king by his magnificent bronze armor and his crimson cloak, coordinated their attack against him. But all the accounts agree that his body, where it fell, became the focal point of the conflict's most intense and savage fighting. The Persians, understanding the immense symbolic value of capturing the Spartan king's corpse, made 4 separate charges to seize it. And 4 times, the Spartans, with a fanatical and grief-driven determination, drove them back, protecting their fallen leader. For these warriors, to abandon their king's body would be a disgrace far worse than death itself. During this final, chaotic phase of the battle, the Theban contingent, whose loyalty had been in question from the beginning, reportedly surrendered to the Persians. They laid down their arms and begged for quarter, identifying themselves as sympathizers to the Persian cause. The Thespians, by contrast, fought alongside the Spartans to the very end. Led by their general, Demophilus, these ordinary citizen soldiers, men without Sparta's lifetime of military conditioning, matched their allies in courage, demonstrating that the love of freedom was not a uniquely Spartan virtue. As their numbers dwindled and their spears shattered, the last of the defenders, their bodies slick with sweat and blood, fought on with their short swords, the xiphos. And when their swords broke, they fought with daggers, with rocks, and with their bare hands. In the end, with the Greeks overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of numbers, the Persians withdrew their infantry and brought their archers forward. From the surrounding heights, they poured volley after volley of arrows into the shrinking circle of survivors on the small hill. The last of the heroes fell, not in the clash of close combat, but under a great, dark storm of Persian arrows. With the last Greek warrior fallen, a great and profound silence descended upon the pass. The battle was over. When Xerxes surveyed the scene, his rage at the unprecedented resistance and the heavy losses his army had suffered was immense. He ordered that the body of King Leonidas be found, that his head be cut off, and that it be impaled on a stake, an extraordinary dishonor in Persian custom, reserved only for the most hated of rebels. This act of desecration, intended to demoralize the other Greeks, instead crystallized their hatred of Persian rule and strengthened their resolve to resist. The battle at the Hot Gates had ended, but its true meaning, its immortal legacy, was just beginning to unfold. As the last Greek warrior fell upon the small hillock, a profound and unnatural silence descended upon the pass at Thermopylae. The thunder of battle, the clash of bronze, the desperate war cries, all were gone, replaced by the low moans of the thousands of wounded and the quiet, sighing of the wind as it stirred the dust of the battlefield. The great battle was over. The pass had been taken. Xerxes, the great king, had won his victory. When the dust had settled, Xerxes himself, accompanied by his commanders, came down from his hillside throne to survey the scene of his costly triumph. He walked among the heaps of the fallen, his gaze taking in the terrible price that had been paid to secure this narrow passage. But his victory felt hollow. He was enraged by the unprecedented resistance, by the sheer, stubborn defiance of these few men who had cost him 3 days and thousands of his own soldiers, including 2 of his own brothers. And his rage found its focus on the body of the man who had led them. He ordered that the corpse of the Spartan king, Leonidas, be found among the slain. When it was brought before him, he commanded that the king's head be cut off and that it be impaled on a stake, an extraordinary dishonor in both Greek and Persian custom, an act of desecration intended to demoralize any other Greeks who might dare to resist his advance. But this act of vengeance would have the opposite effect, crystallizing the hatred of the Greeks and strengthening their resolve to fight on. While Leonidas and his men were making their final, heroic stand at the hot gates, an equally crucial battle had been unfolding just miles away, on the azure waters of the Strait of Artemisium. Here, the combined Greek fleet, primarily composed of the powerful triremes of Athens, had been engaging the massive Persian navy in a sprawling, three-day naval confrontation. The two battles were inextricably linked, two halves of a single, unified strategy. The stand at the narrow pass was meant to hold the Persian army, while the fleet at the narrow strait was meant to hold the Persian navy, preventing them from landing troops behind the Greek defenders. For 3 days, the Greek fleet, though vastly outnumbered, had fought with incredible skill and courage. They used their superior knowledge of the local currents and their more maneuverable ships to inflict significant damage on the larger, more cumbersome Persian vessels. And on the first night of the battle, nature itself had intervened. A violent summer storm had battered the Persian fleet, which was caught in exposed positions, destroying hundreds of their ships and significantly reducing their numerical advantage. The Greeks, who had sheltered their own fleet in protected coves, saw this as a clear sign of divine favor. But on the third day, as news of the betrayal by Ephialtes and the encirclement of Leonidas's force reached the naval commanders, they knew that their own position had become untenable. With the pass about to fall, there was no longer any reason to hold the strait. To remain would be to risk being trapped themselves. And so, after a final, fierce engagement, the Greek naval commanders made the difficult but necessary decision to withdraw. Under the cover of darkness, the Greek fleet slipped away, sailing southward to regroup and prepare for the next great confrontation, which they now knew would have to take place in the waters closer to their own homes, near the island of Salamis. With the pass at Thermopylae now cleared, and the Greek fleet in retreat, the path into central Greece lay open. The great Persian army resumed its advance, a slow, inexorable tide of conquest. The cities of Boeotia, including the powerful city of Thebes, now formally submitted to the Persian king, their resistance broken by the news of the defeat at the hot gates. The Persian army moved on toward its primary target, the proud, defiant city of Athens, the city that Xerxes held most responsible for the Greek resistance. But when the Persian vanguard reached the city, they found it strangely, eerily empty. The great Athenian statesman, Themistocles, in a brilliant and audacious strategic move, had convinced his fellow citizens to do the unthinkable, to completely evacuate their city. Every man, woman, and child had abandoned their homes, seeking refuge on the nearby island of Salamis, placing their entire faith and their future in the wooden walls of their great fleet. When the Persians entered Athens, they found only a handful of temple guardians and elderly citizens who had barricaded themselves on the high, rocky plateau of the Acropolis. After a brief siege, these last defenders were overwhelmed, and Xerxes, in his anger, ordered the city burned. The smoke from the burning temples of Athens, including the great sanctuary of Athena herself, was visible from the island of Salamis, a terrible sight that filled the hearts of the watching Athenians with a mixture of horror and a new, cold resolve. The battle at the hot gates had been a military defeat. But its psychological impact, the story of its heroic sacrifice, was already transforming into a powerful legend that was spreading throughout the Greek world. It had demonstrated that the Persians were not invincible. It had shown that free men, fighting for their homes and their laws, could stand against the might of a great empire. And it had bought the Greek alliance precious, invaluable time. Time for the main Greek army to assemble. Time for the fleet to regroup. And time for the great city of Athens to be evacuated. The seeds of the final Greek victories at the great naval battle of Salamis, and the decisive land battle of Plataea the following year, were sown in the blood-soaked earth of that narrow pass. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans had not been in vain. It was a defeat that would, in the end, lead to a victory that would secure the future of their entire civilization. The story of the Battle of Thermopylae, in the immediate, cold calculus of military outcomes, was a defeat. The pass was taken. The defenders were annihilated. And the path to Athens lay open for the invading Persian host. But history is not always written by the immediate victors. Sometimes, a story's true meaning, its enduring power, is forged not in victory, but in the manner of its defeat. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his small band of heroes at the Hot Gates became something far more powerful than a simple military victory could ever have been. It became a legend, an immortal echo that would resonate through the ages, a timeless testament to the power of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the story of the stand at Thermopylae spread like a wildfire throughout the remaining free cities of Greece. It was carried by the soldiers who had been honorably dismissed by Leonidas, men who could bear witness to the king's resolve. It was told by the sailors of the Greek fleet, who had seen the smoke from the pass and understood the sacrifice that had been made to allow for their own safe withdrawal. The tale was not one of despair, but of a fierce and defiant pride. It transformed the perception of the war. The Persians were no longer seen as an invincible, divine force of nature. They had been held for 3 days, and made to pay a terrible price in blood, by a mere handful of free men. The psychological impact of this realization was immense. It stiffened the resolve of the Greek alliance and inspired a new and powerful sense of unity, a shared Hellenic identity forged in the crucible of this common threat. This newfound spirit of defiance found its ultimate expression in the great naval battle that followed. The Athenian statesman, Themistocles, brilliantly used the legend of Thermopylae to his advantage. He lured the larger, more cumbersome Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis, near Athens, a maritime battlefield that mirrored the geographical constraints of the Hot Gates. Here, in these confined waters, the superior maneuverability of the smaller Greek triremes once again negated the Persians' numerical advantage. And just as the Spartans had fought for their fallen king, the Athenians now fought with the fury of men who had seen their own city burned, their sacred temples desecrated. The result was a stunning and decisive Greek victory. The Persian fleet was shattered, and Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shore, was forced to witness the destruction of his naval power. With his sea lanes now threatened, the great king retreated with a large portion of his army back to Asia, leaving his general, Mardonius, to complete the conquest the following year. The final act of the Greco-Persian Wars was played out on the plains of Plataea in 479 BCE. Here, the combined Greek land army, led by the Spartan general Pausanias, finally met the remaining Persian force in a great, pitched battle. The memory of Thermopylae served as a powerful rallying cry. The Greeks fought with a discipline and a ferocity born of the knowledge that they were fighting for their very existence. The Persian army was annihilated, and the threat of Persian domination was ended forever. The victory at Plataea, which secured the future of Western civilization, was made possible by the sacrifice at Thermopylae a year earlier. In the years that followed, the site of the battle at the Hot Gates became a sacred place. The Greeks recovered the bodies of their fallen heroes, including the remains of King Leonidas, and buried them with the highest honors. They erected monuments on the small hill where the last stand had taken place. The most famous of these was a simple stone lion, dedicated to the memory of Leonidas. And upon another stone, an inscription was carved, a simple, poignant, and immortal epitaph, attributed to the poet Simonides. It was written as if the fallen Spartans themselves were speaking to any traveler who might pass that way. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. This epitaph captures the essence of the Spartan sacrifice. It was not a story of individual glory, but of collective duty, of an unwavering obedience to the laws and the ethos of their city. And this story, preserved by the great Greek historian Herodotus, and retold by countless poets, philosophers, and statesmen in the centuries that followed, became a foundational myth of Western culture. It became a universal symbol of the struggle of a free people against the forces of tyranny, of the power of a few to stand against the many, of the idea that some principles, freedom, honor, duty, are worth dying for. And so, as you drift now into the deep and peaceful realms of sleep, let the story of Thermopylae find its quiet, final rest. The clash of bronze has faded. The great empires have crumbled to dust. The heroes themselves are but names in a timeless story. But the echo of their stand remains. It is an echo that can still be heard in the quiet whisper of the wind as it moves through that lonely mountain pass. It is a story that reminds us that even in the face of certain defeat, there can be a victory of the spirit that transcends time itself. The great battle is over. The heroes are at peace. And now, it is time for you to rest.